My name is Emily Kimani, and I am your UASU VP Operations and Finance, and this is In Conversation With. This is a series where we talk about the Black experience and the different aspects that make up our experiences. Today, I am joined by Dr. Kristin Denise Rowe, and we will be talking about Black hair and the Black beauty standards. Dr. Rowe is an assistant professor of American Studies at California State University, and she teaches Black feminism, beauty, and Black popular culture. Her research examines cultural representations of Black women, specifically questions around standards of beauty and depictions of Black hair. So hello, Dr. Rowe. I am so excited to have you here and have this conversation with you.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I know I gave a little bit of a background at the beginning, but can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work?
Again, my name is Dr. Kristin Denise Rowe. I teach at California State University, Fullerton in the American Studies department. I generally kind of teach and think a lot about sort of pop cultural representations at intersections of race and gender. And as you kind of spoke about, I focus a lot on sort of beauty culture, body politics, embodiment, those sorts of things. And so I graduated from Michigan State University with my doctorate in African American and African Studies in 2019. And so I've just been living here in Southern California and kind of rocking out ever since.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. So just diving right in, can you take us through the history of Black hair and beauty standards and highlight some of the milestone movements in history?
Yeah. I mean, the history is so rich, so huge, so big. We could take the rest of the time to kind of do that. So what I wanted to do was kind of hit on a few touchstone kind of linchpin moments, right? Kind of go to different periods that are really kind of integral to shaping kind of where we're at now. So if we take it kind of all the way back, sort of pre-colonial Africa, continental Africa, we know that we saw really intricate braiding styles and sort of weaving, stylization that could be specific to different families, ethnic groups. It involved jewelries, shells, really sort of creative, kind of intricate patterns in terms of the stylization of the hair. Then when we go to kind of the Middle Passage into enslavement, sort of African Americans and folks in sort of North America, Black people, hair was often covered. It was sometimes put into thick braids, right? It was folks kind of working out in the sun, kind of things like that. So hair protection, hair covering was huge. There weren't products at the time for these enslaved people to kind of style their hair. So they created these products based on different things that they could find in their homes. So maybe foods, animal products, those kinds of things to make the hair soft, more manageable, and to make it sort of be able to be styled, right? Sometimes if they worked in the domestic sphere, their hair might be straightened or they might wear a wig, that sort of being closer to kind of the serving of food and that presentation. Then you might get into kind of more styled hair, straightened hair from that standpoint. Go to,
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So if we go to kind of post-Reconstruction, kind of the late 1800s and early 1900s, that's when we start to see kind of Black hair culture take off from a sort of entrepreneurial standpoint. We could talk about Annie Turnbow Malone. Of course, we know Madam C.J. Walker. These were some of the earliest Black hair care entrepreneurs, right? And some of the earliest kind of Black beauticians, Black beauty salons, barbershops. We really kind of see those take shape in the early kind of 1900s. And even in this moment and sort of throughout, we can begin to see the sort of politicization of Black hair. So sort of Annie Turnbow Malone, Madam C.J. Walker, kind of club women, these upper middle class Black women of this period were really invested in sort of hair presentation as a way to sort of garner respectability, right? So kind of conforming to particular stands of respectability, really kind of coming out in the hair stylization, right? We want our hair neat, we want our hair healthy, we want our hair to look a certain way. And so if we fast forward a bit into the 1960s, we have this kind of moment in which Black power, Black is beautiful. It's this really kind of watershed moment in the late 1960s. The natural as a kind of Afro style really kind of takes off and becomes symbolic of this sort of Black power, Black is beautiful, a particular political orientation. And then 1970s, kind of this into the 1980s, we kind of get a conservative backlash to all of that stuff. The Afro kind of becomes commodified in a particular kind of way. But a lot of women in the 1980s are just going back to kind of straightened hair, wigs, relaxers, because folks need jobs. Folks need sort of the material conditions that kind of erupt out of this conservative backlash require a sort of going back to a sort of resetting in terms of going away from the natural and kind of going to these other styles. We also know the Jerry curl, huge thing during this period as well. Yeah. And so 1990s, we get kind of some new technology in terms of sort of wigs, weaves, sort of braiding hair, kanekalon hair, sort of different kinds of product. And these new forms of technology, as well as a sort of multicultural, post-racial rhetoric really kind of allows room for all kinds of different styles, right? We have kind of icons like Black sitcom characters from Moesha and Living Single, kind of showing us a variety of different hairstyles. But at the same time, kind of on the ground, a lot of Black women are relaxing their hair still and kind of doing weaves as a form of art form as well. And so that kind of takes us up to the 2000s. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the natural hair movement, and so we can get into that period in more depth. But I think what's interesting is that in each of these periods, right, there's really kind of dynamic, complex relationships with Black women to Black hair. So it's never just one thing. It's never just kind of one narrative. It's never just sort of, we're conforming to beauty standards and now we're resisting them. It's never monolithic in that way, but we can always kind of see complexity in terms of stylization, diversity in terms of stylization. It's race, it's class, it's gendered, it's all of it. So I could say more, but I think I'll just kind of leave it there for now.
Yeah, and we definitely will touch on the natural hair movement because it's so big right now. But before we dive into that, in your opinion, what are the intersections between Black hair and Black beauty? Do you think it shapes our identity in terms of beauty, and how are the two correlated?
Yeah. So for me, I think that I'm sort of interested more broadly in sort of embodiment, right? And I think that beauty standards is sort of one way to think about those things. And so I think beauty is so fascinating. And I think Black women are so interested in conversations around beauty because beauty represents so much. Like, I think it's very easy to kind of dismiss it as something that's frivolous. It's just hair, it's just makeup, right? But as that sort of historicizing we were just doing kind of illustrates, right? It is about so many other things. It's about sort of individual expression. It's about sort of having agency over one's body. It's about sort of systems of oppression, sort of intersections of racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, homophobia. All these things inform and shape what we view as beautiful, kind of who has access to that beauty arena, right? And I think that for Black women, so many of them relate to that sort of push-pull of Black hair culture being this really rich and dynamic thing, the socialization from Black girlhood to Black womanhood that happens sort of in our mother's laps and in beauty salons and those sorts of spaces, kind of connecting with other Black women like, oh, I see your hair, or, oh, what kind of product do you use, right? Those things kind of being really defining in terms of Black women's experiences, but also at the same time, sometimes hair and beauty politics being fraught, right? Do I conform? Can I find products that work for me? Can I see representations of myself as beautiful? Was I raised to think that my skin tone or my hair texture wasn't good or wasn't beautiful? Do I feel sort of excluded from sort of particular arenas and conversations around beauty. And so I think for so many Black women, it's always been both, right? It's been this kind of site of agency, resistance, self-expression, and sort of sisterhood among Black girls and Black women and Black femmes. But it's also kind of this site of oppression, the site of struggle, the site of difficulty, right? And so I think kind of those things kind of coexisting, and how that coexistence comes out in Black women's art and narratives are really kind of the things I'm interested in. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so interesting, because speaking from my experience, like you touched on, like since childhood to womanhood, I've always, like, my hair has always been so impactful in those experiences. If it's from like elementary to junior high, I remember my mom relaxing my hair like every 2 weeks, like that was just like a thing that we did every Sunday. To university, where I started to embrace my natural hair and like take part of the natural hair movement, it's definitely such a keystone in my identity. So very, very complex, as you were touching on. And so kind of going back to the natural hair movement that we touched on at the beginning, can you talk a bit about that and its significance and why it's been so impactful?
Yeah, definitely. So from kind of the mid to late 2000s, some of us who do this kind of trace its beginnings to like 2005, 2006-ish, we start to see, up until the contemporary, we start to see a critical mass of Black women stop chemically relaxing or chemically straightening their hair with these things called relaxers. As you already mentioned, it's a sort of chemical compound that straightens your hair, alters the texture of your hair from a sort of kinky, coily texture to a straight one. So a critical mass of Black women stop using these relaxers and start to wear their hair in favor of these natural hairstyles, or sort of whether it's their own natural hair or kind of hairstyles that sort of mimic a natural hair texture. And so it's hard to kind of trace the exact numbers of how many women this happened with, but we can see some indicators, right? We see a steady decrease in relaxer sales. We've seen a steady increase of all other kind of hair products. We've seen kind of multiplied attendance at natural hair shows and natural hair meetups. We see more natural hair products on the shelves in places like Walmart and Target and drugstores. We see natural hair care lines really sort of proliferating. We see more natural hair influencers on YouTube and Instagram kind of getting thousands and thousands and thousands of followers. So all these things are happening sort of in the past, again, let's say 15 to 20 years. And so a lot of kind of different factors are thought to have helped cause this. One, we see a sort of overarching across race, kind of across the West, an interest in sort of going green and natural kind of products, and sort of environmentalism, kind of global warming as an existential threat. And Inconvenient Truth and Food Inc. kind of come out around these times, these documentaries that are really kind of watershed moments in these conversations. We see more conversations around legislation for this stuff. So we have this overall kind of emphasis. We're in this period of like the natural, the organic, the environmental. And so for a lot of Black women, kind of going natural kind of fits into that discursive space, right? We also see, of course, a proliferation of social media and new media. So a lot of these spaces like YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, these are spaces where women are connecting with these natural hair influencers, which is a relatively new thing as well, of course. And these influencers are doing product reviews. This product worked for my hair while this one didn't. A lot of these influencers are teaching kind of, this is how you can style your afro, a braid out, a twist out. This is how you can do wash and maintain and kind of take care of your hair. So these women are kind of relearning through the internet how to engage with their natural hair texture in a way that is arguably unprecedented because many of them have never even seen their natural hair texture. So as you were just mentioning, I think your story is so similar to a lot of women in that they began to have their hair relaxed as young children. So they never had that sort of engagement with their natural hair texture until they go natural as adults or as young women. And so it's like, how do I take care of this? How do I maintain this? What products do I use? How do I style it? Those kinds of spaces the internet allows room for in these sort of unprecedented ways. So more products, more conversations around how to do one's hair based on the internet, more interest in going green, going natural. And all of this stuff kind of has these really big impact on these kind of individual Black women who are making these big changes with their hair. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think the natural hair movement is also a part of kind of reclaiming our identity as Black people, you know, rejecting colonial and Eurocentric ideals and fully embracing our own identity?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think for some Black women, it can be. It very much sort of is that. I think for some of them, another thing in terms of this kind of timeline of the natural hair movement is we also get the emergence of Black Lives Matter. The Trayvon Martin killing was, I believe, 2012. And so kind of parallel happenings around Black Lives Matter, conversations around anti-Black racism, conversations around sort of Black girl magic and sort of those sorts of things are happening at this time as well. And so for a lot of Black women involved in this space, I think it is. I think it can be political. I think it can be connected to kind of anti-racism, pro-Blackness, diasporic connections, kind of continental Africa. I think it can be those things, both kind of tangibly and imagined. I think for a lot of women, though, it is more connected to kind of some of the other things around going natural, kind of an interest in the organic, kind of an interest in kind of using less chemicals. And for a lot of women, I think myself included, they go natural because the relaxer was breaking their hair. That was me at the age of like 17 or 18. It's just like, I can't continue to do this. I can't continue to relax my hair, or I'm not going to have any hair. And so I think the damage of the relaxer combined with, again, the internet providing a space to kind of learn and figure out how to work with your natural hair texture is part of it too. So I think, yes, it can be sort of a political and sort of about pride and Black pride and those sorts of things. But I also think that there are, in these spaces, sometimes a lot of anti-Blackness in terms of beauty standards. There's a lot of women kind of struggling with self-concept and self-identity. There's a lot of women struggling to accept their natural hair. And I think that's actually one of the most beautiful parts about this is that it just provides space for those conversations, right? It provides spaces for women to be like, I don't like my hair today. Like I don't like how it looks. It's not growing fast enough. It doesn't look like how I thought it was going to look. And then they can kind of have these conversations with other women and they'll say, I get it. You're not alone. And so saying all that to say, I think it can be connected to kind of self-love, Black pride, those sorts of things, those sort of more political things. But I also think that I always kind of push back against that narrative that if you are relaxing your hair, wearing wigs or wearing weaves, you're assimilating and you hate yourself and you are just conforming to beauty standards. And when you go natural, you're free and now you love yourself and you're subverting something and you're decolonizing your head and those kinds of that language too, because I think that it's not linear in that way. Often it's more layered in that way, but certainly I think that can be a part of it for some people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but in considering all the historical context that you touched on at the very beginning, do you think the natural hair movement is a shift in our society, kind of symbolizes that shift in that we are making some progress into the future?
Yeah. I always get this question, and I think it's so, I'm for some reason really averse to trying to predict the future. I feel like when people say like, is this song going to be a classic, or will we be talking about this artist in 20 years? I'm just like, I don't know. Okay. I don't know. But I think, sure, I think there's definitely a way we can see different markers that feel like they would be hard to go back from. Like, I can't see us going back from. So for example, this thing about the ubiquity of natural hair products, sort of brands like Shea Moisture, Carol's Daughter, Oyen Handmade, new ones like Pattern, those natural hair care brands, the sort of seeing entire shelves in like a Target or Walgreens or something like that, for natural hair care products that target women with tightly coiled hair or just curly hair in general. When I first went natural, that was not there. That was simply not there, didn't have the presence that it has. And with the sales, I have trouble picturing us kind of going back to not having natural hair care products on the shelf and readily available, and sort of being a part of our beauty culture in that way. I have trouble picturing that. I have trouble picturing the same number of Black women or generations of Black women coming forward, going back to relaxing their hair at the rates that they did pre-2000s, though I have seen pieces about some women going back to relaxers. I don't think we have numbers on that yet, but I have trouble seeing the rate of relaxers go back to how it was 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So certain things I have trouble picturing us not moving forward or not maintaining a sort of groundbreaking cultural shift. But at the same time, people probably thought that in the late 1960s during the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
They probably said the same thing. So, I mean, though I think the numbers weren't as wide as they are for this contemporary natural hair movement. So,
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers it, but I some things I have trouble picturing us going back. I think we can only go forward, but
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, but listen, Shea Moisture and Cantu has saved me on multiple occasions. So let's hope that it's still on the shelf like 5 years from now.
We're actually kind of like OGs. I feel like those two are really kind of like, they were out when I went natural, like maybe 10, 12 years ago. So
yeah, let's hope. And what role do you think social media has played? Like not only in the natural hair movement, but like in Black hair and like Black beauty in general?
Yeah. That's such a big question. I think kind of like I was saying before, on one level, it's provided this kind of space for learning, space for community, kind of being able to kind of go and figure out how to do your natural hair, kind of how to take care of your natural hair, how to style it, how to maintain it, and to find other Black women who kind of are in community with you in some of these struggles and some of these experiences and some of these conversations. So I think those are some good things about it, some positive things about it. It's a space for sharing information. It's a space for community. I also think it's a very cool space for innovation from a kind of entrepreneurial and artistic standpoint. So folks can kind of come up with their own products or their own wig line or their own extensions or their own pick, or now they're selling edge brushes, whereas like for a long time we just used toothbrushes. Now they've like come out with brushes especially designed for kind of smoothing
your edges, your baby hairs.
Let me not do it like actually have smooth ones, but that sort of thing, right? So from an even the sort of creation of new hairstyling techniques are sort of huge. From that entrepreneurial standpoint, someone can go viral and make a living from that kind of thing. And it's a space for innovation in that kind of way. And so I think the sharing information, the community aspect, and the space for kind of ideas entrepreneurship to kind of spread and proliferate. I think those are some of the positive things about it, the pretty things about it, the great things about it. I think there are other things about it that are a little bit darker. I think on one level, social media has kind of made our society in general a kind of much more hyper visible society, and sort of much more, I'm sorry, I'll close my inbox, a much more sort of investment in sort of visibility that can make the beauty standards seem much more attainable, that can make the beauty standards seem much more high stakes, right? We have things like filters that really have kind of upped the ante in terms of distortion of not only other people's image, but our ability to mold and shape our own self-image, right? To the point that you have cases of people wanting to get plastic surgery to match how they look in their Snapchat filter, or people wanting to being unable to kind of take an image of themselves that has not been altered, right? We have kind of these conversations around Facebook and Instagram, the impact on young women and girls in particular. And I think Black women, you know, of course, are not apart from any of that, right? They're very much a part of that. So I think there's a lot positive, but there's also a lot of tough conversations we need to have about kind of some of the potentially more harmful aspects too, I think.
Yeah, and you completely touched on my next question, which was going to be, what are the negative sides of social media? Do you want to expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, kind of what I've said about the kind of high stakesness of the image, kind of how we look, kind of attaining particular beauty standards, those beauty standards being tied to kind of our popularity on the internet, like the filters, the kind of photo editing services. And I think all of those things have the potential to kind of impact Black women in particular ways. So some of the Black women that I've written about in the contemporary natural hair movement have talked about the ways that sort of algorithms do not tend to favor dark-skinned Black women or Black women with kinky hair, right? They can't get the same levels of views or following. There's, of course, lots of conversations about sort of racial ambiguity and mixed race embodiment really being kind of privileged as sort of markers or representatives of Black womanhood. And so where does that leave Black women in these social spaces that do not conform to those particular standards of beauty, right? But I think at the same time, just to kind of, you know, give both sides, because I really do think it's nuanced. You have pages like 4C Hair Chicks, which specifically represents Black women with kinky hair with intentionality on Instagram. So this is all we show. So if you want that kind of representation, there is ways for you to seek it out, or kind of pages like Divine Dark Skin, I think that's what it's called, kind of pages for dark skinned Black women. So though the sort of larger standards of beauty that circulate on social media can be really limiting, very narrow, very harmful, maybe potentially very damaging, it at the same time does provide a space for folks to create alternatives as well, even if those alternatives might not ultimately be as popular or as lucrative. So it's complex. I think like any form of technological advancement, right? We were having these conversations about TV. We were having these conversations about the internet when it first began. And so I think it's both and, but I do think there is something specific about kind of smartphone-ness and the ubiquity of it all and the ways in which we're kind of tethered to so much of this technology. I do think that's arguably unprecedented. So
yeah,
it's complex is, I guess, long story short.
Yeah, and you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I think social media has also created this space of community within like Black hair, whether it's memes about like combing your hair and like burning your ear, or like sitting there for like 7 hours getting your braids done. Like there's a sense of I get you, you get me, you know, and like we can get through this.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. And my last question for you is, so most of us know the definition of colorism and what comes with that, but can you explain its interactions with texturism and Black beauty? Because I don't think that's really talked about much.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of how far back I should go. Sort of thinking about kind of enslavement, post-enslavement for much of kind of history in the West, sort of intra-racially, Black people have kind of used this language colloquially of good hair and bad hair. There's been a sort of hierarchical understanding of hair texture and sort of hair's appearance, right, as it sort of shows up on people's heads. And so good hair was often thought of as hair that more closely sort of approximated an anti-Black ideal. So kind of loosely curled texture, long hair, kind of more spiraled curls, right? More kind of defined curl pattern. Whereas bad hair was thought of to be kind of closer to Africanness or sort of more closely connected to Blackness, and how it was represented or how it kind of shows up is a kinkier hair texture, afro hair texture, a more coily hair texture. And so for many Black women, this kind of hierarchy of hair texture, this kind of dichotomy of good hair and bad hair that shows up in this hierarchical way, they've sort of in the advent of kind of social media, these kind of new natural hair movement conversations, they've argued that this shows up sort of structurally or sort of systemically in this idea of texturism. And so texturism is kind of very tied to colorism, which you were just mentioning. Colorism being, again, a sort of structural, systemic, larger preference for lighter skin tones often over darker skin tone. Again, something that has existed throughout history within the West, throughout history within the US. And so these things were often kind of connected and overlapped in order to kind of construct a anti-Black beauty standard. And so for these women online, the texturism has showed up in the natural hair movement and outside of it, sort of intra-racially and sort of globally. And so what it ultimately looks like is a sort of preference for these looser curls, sort of kind of ringlet, kind of looser curl, often longer hair textures in favor of a kinkier Afro textured hair texture. And so how this kind of shows up in a lot of these kind of natural hair movement spaces, kind of like I was mentioning before, a lot of women with kinky hair textures don't feel represented. They don't feel like their hair is praised or seen as beautiful. They don't feel like, from a utility standpoint, the products that a lot of people like work with kinky hair texture. They more so are made for curls of all type, white, Black, or whatever. And so for them, the kind of the heart of the beef, right, is that the natural hair movement was built for kinkier hair texture. A lot of these brands we were just talking about, like Shea Moisture, were built on sales by Black women with kinky hair, yet so often these women do not get represented kind of in the advertisements, in the influencer market, sort of in the utility of the products. And so that's the critique, is that there is this sort of systemic structural preference for a particular type of hair texture. And so this language of texturism, Black women have really kind of, as far as I can tell, theorized it organically on the internet, right? Curl discrimination is also kind of language that they sometimes use for this. And so again, I think for kind of maybe some folks who haven't experienced it or some folks not as familiar with the community, I think, again, it's easy to kind of be like, we're kind of splitting hairs here, no pun intended. It's just hair, everybody's natural, everybody's Black. What difference does it make, right? But I think it, like colorism, is something that exists intra-racially and sort of outside in the sort of larger society, and it's representative of something, right? Which is a sort of denigration of what is Black, a sort of denigration of what is seen as African or sort of or Black phenotypically, a sort of a classed, a raced, a gendered a system that shows up in hair texture. So from that standpoint, it's not just hair. It again is connected to kind of some of these larger body politics.
Yeah. And so would you say that like colorism and texturism are sort of parallels to each other?
Yeah, I think that I sometimes jokingly call them like sisters or cousins. I think that like a lot of times they get brought up in the same conversation. So when we talk about sort of beauty ideals who are name checked in sort of music, light skin with good hair is a phrase that we'll often hear. Sort of some of the sort of archetypal figures in the natural hair movement, a Tracee Ellis Ross, a Yara Shahidi, a Zendaya, right? These kind of folks that people, even like a Beyonce or a Solange, right? These kind of folks that people find really popular, often kind of have those two things together, light skin and quote unquote good hair, curly hair. And so when so often kind of that gets represented as what is beautiful, what is, though I think one of the most recent conversations about this as of like a week or two ago was the Netflix film, The Harder They Fall was released. And Stagecoach Mary, who was a real person, you can sort of see her picture if you Google it, was casted a sort of older, larger, curvier, dark-skinned Black woman in real life, casted by Zazie Bates, who is incredibly talented, but a younger, thin, biracial, mixed race woman with curly, again, sort of loosely curled, good hair, quote unquote. And so you're talking about someone who was an actual person who existed in real life. It's I think it's bad enough when this happens with fictional characters, but you're talking about an actual person who existed in real life being cast as a light-skinned woman with good hair. And this isn't even a character who is supposed to be, like, her appearance isn't even a thing that is supposed to be focused on, right? But there's a way in which if we like to see Black women, we often like to see them look a particular way. And so I think that's changing. I think that we're having more conversations. I think it's getting better, but I think it's certainly still something to kind of push on. Yeah.
Yeah, I have so many other questions, but our time unfortunately has run out. So on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Rowe, for joining me today and having this conversation. I definitely learned a lot and came out with a lot of this conversation. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having me. This was a blast.